So what they came up with was actually a sideways growing plant. It's very interesting. They have these almost like shelves that are spring loaded to expand, and they put the seeds and the dirt in there, and then as the plants grow, they move it down this hemispherical rack, so that the shelf that these are in grows, giving the plants more space to grow, and they are able to control the growth rate of the plants in this manner.
Hey guys, before the episode starts, I'd like to give a quick thanks to all my supporters. It's greatly appreciated that anyone who listens to this podcast supports it. It's very nice to know that people are willing to help out with this and that they see it to be something worth investing in. Right now, it's just faith. Thank you again, whoever you are. For donating to this podcast. It's by no means an obligation, so anyone listening to this, don't feel like you need to give me any kind of financial support for this. Any is appreciated, but again, I'm not going to ask that of you guys. I don't like to ask you guys to pay for a product like this. It's just something that I like to do for fun, so yeah, definitely not required, but greatly appreciated when it is. I also like to thank our sponsor for today's episode, Anchor. There will be an ad for that halfway through, but again, just thank all of you for so much for tuning in every episode and just giving your undivided attention and support, and it means so much to me. So thank all of you, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Hello and welcome to Talk Ag to Me, a podcast dedicated to improving ag literacy around the globe. I'm your host, Brendan Black, and in today's episode, we're going to talk about a little bit of a different topic. Now, as you heard in our previous episodes, we've talked about agriculture in different types of environments before, one of them being in Mars. Today's episode is going to be somewhat similar to that, but agriculture in space and a few other topics surrounding that. To help with this episode, I have a guest, somewhat of a newer podcaster to the scene. His name is Jake, and he's going to give his own little introduction. Jake, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Brendan. So my name's Jake. I run a podcast called Know Too Much. I come from an academic background. I currently study astronautical engineering and am currently designing a lunar base for NASA. So I would consider myself growing in knowledge on the idea of using plants in space as living and breathing sources.
Awesome. Well, yeah, that's great to hear. So I'm glad to have you on here. It's really exciting to hear you reach out and talk about that kind of stuff. So I'm pretty excited to get into the episode. If you're ready to go.
Yep, I'm ready.
Cool. So before I start with the questions or the discussion or anything, kind of my go-to question for every guest I have on this podcast is, would you mind explaining what, if any, experience you have with agriculture, with food production, with anything in that industry?
So agriculturally, I grew up in a relatively rural area. So I did have corn growing around me a lot. My extended family largely grew up on a farm, whereas I grew up in more of a suburbia area. So I've heard about farming, some of the practices like crop rotations and such. But personally, the most I've ever gotten to is I drove an Alice Chalmer, and I have played Farming Simulator. So don't have too much experience directly.
Hey, you got more experience than some people do. Awesome. Well, yeah, I'm glad to hear it. So, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no. I was just going to say that I was very fortunate to get to drive those tractors and learn the mechanical stuff behind them, so it was nice.
Yeah. No, it's interesting stuff. So, kind of jumping into our topic today, you said you had some good sources and some good information for us. So, before we get started, why don't you kind of introduce the idea for what we're going to be talking about today?
Okay. So, as I said, I am designing a lunar habitat. Mm-hmm. So, back in the late 70s, NASA commissioned a program to look into the feasibility of growing plants on the lunar surface. Not to be confused with growing it like in lunar dirt. We're still growing it in Earth dirt that we just shipped up there. But there are a lot of issues in terms of growing it on the moon that I can talk about a little bit later. but we have been doing physical tests, not just thought experiments, on the International Space Station. They have been growing plants up there for a while and have actually started to increase the complexity with which they're growing them spring of 2018, so just a few years ago. And when they grow them, they then freeze them and send them back to Earth for analysis. And we can learn more and more about how plants grow in microgravity, these confined spaces, different processes for growing them. And we can extrapolate that to the moon, Mars, deep space, wherever we want.
That's incredibly interesting stuff. So before we get too much deeper into the informational type of stuff, and maybe this will be a more appropriate question towards the end of the discussion, but do you see food production being a possible reality sometime in the near future, in space? I mean,
Absolutely. Substantial food production could cause issues. And I really wish I could show you one of these flowcharts I have here. It's very complex in how they have to manage the nutrients of the plants and the nutrients of the people to make sure that both the plants and the people are happy in the same environment. Astronauts on the International Space Station have actually eaten red lettuce that they grew up there entirely. They sent up seeds, they sent up dirt, lights and stuff, but they grew it from seed and then ate it up there. And so they have eaten food from space, though lettuce is far from being substantially nutrient full, but I feel like full food production is definitely something we could see in the near future.
Wow, that's awesome. I mean, if that were the case, then that would kind of provide an alternative to the food scarcity that we're starting to see in our own planet. No, that's incredible stuff. So why don't you kind of start to break down kind of the idea behind what you're talking about with the lunar farming kind of thing. What technology is necessary for this thing to be possible? What kind of innovative methods of agriculture are we having to use? I'm assuming some kind of hydroponics or other alternative forms of agriculture being used in this instance. Like how does low gravity farming work? Could you kind of just explain some of that stuff for the audience?
Right. So yes, one of the options that group came up with in the late 70s was to use hydroponics or aeroponics, and they talked about different ideas in that regard. Though back then, really the main method of producing food was still in dirt. So what they came up with was actually a sideways growing plant. It's very interesting. They have these almost like shelves that are spring loaded to expand, and they put the seeds and the dirt in there, and then as the plants grow, they move it down this hemispherical rack so that the shelf that these are in grows, giving the plants more space to grow, and they are able to control the growth rate of the plants in this manner, and they can control what nutrients go in and how much light they get. And that's seems to be the main method that they are trying to achieve.
That's interesting. So where do you think, just from an understanding of the science of it today versus way back in the 70s when they first tried it, where do you think that they were going wrong, or where do you think they're going right necessarily?
I think they were definitely going right in their growth control. I think that's a very important aspect that we're going to see on the moon that we don't necessarily have here on Earth. Really, on Earth, we're just trying to grow as much as fast as possible. Whereas up there, you don't necessarily want as much as fast as possible. You want to be able to control when it's ready to go to harvest and how much nutrients it's absorbing, because that's all very limited. You don't want 1,000 pounds of potatoes and nowhere to put it, because you can't just set it outside. You have to keep it inside, and if you keep it inside, that's taking up space that you just don't then have to keep other equipment. And I think that's going to be the main factor that we have to analyze, is how do we control the growth, and how do we control the resources that it's absorbing, the resources that it's expelling.
So, do you see the potential solution to the growth control issue being possible colonization, or is that kind of something that's? I mean, I'm thinking more in terms of Mars, but in terms of the moon, I'm sure that's a little bit more difficult to pull off.
Right. So colonization is very far away.
Mm-hmm.
Commercially colonizing at all. Um, in terms of food production leading to colonies, as soon as we can get a base on the moon and we can scientifically study different types of plants. There's even I have a book here on lunar bases, and they talk about using animals as food and the different pros and cons, which animals to use, which animals are a little so-so. They even get into seafood. If we can get that scientifically proven, tested, I think we can definitely start to see moon ranches, if you will, just like pastures of artificial nutrients under a big dome. I think that could definitely be somewhere in the further future for sure, but in the future.
Yeah, no, that's definitely interesting. I kind of want to see what the moon ranches would look like. All
Yeah,
the cows about all the songs about cows jumping over the moon would be not so fantasy anymore.
absolutely.
So, what do you think is the how do I put this? So, actually, I did have a question about the nutrients, kind of like you were talking just now. So, as far as the technology is going right now, how are they how are they getting the nutrients for the crops that they're growing? Are they synthetic nutrients? Are they synthetic? Are they synthetic fertilizers? Are they using organic soil from Earth and just sending it up there and keeping it preserved so that way the microorganisms are staying intact? Or how are they transporting those nutrients in a way that are still usable for the plants?
To my knowledge, the nutrients are being transported and inserted into the soil artificially as
Mm.
like a fertilizer almost. And that way they can control exactly what levels of nitrogen and oxygen and so forth are present in the soil.
Yeah, that would definitely make a lot more sense. I think that the full transfusion of soil from Earth and hoping to maintain all those nutrients just isn't realistic, just because they probably couldn't get large enough samples to their location and in the small space they're able to transport it. So that would make sense that they're using artificial nutrients. So in terms of the uh, I keep forgetting. I keep having this question pop into my mind. I keep forgetting what it is though. I'll come back to it later. Um, so why don't you explain a little bit about what exactly your role is in the project that you're working on, if you don't mind?
Okay, yeah. So in the project that I'm working on, right now we're in a very beginning stage. We're still working on a conceptual design, um, along with some administrative issues that always pop up on such an expensive project. But right now, my current role is the structure of the habitat. So how it's shaped, how it's going to hold people, where the stuff's going to go, how are we going to run plumbing and electrical throughout the habitat.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that's definitely I can imagine the structure is incredibly important to making all that stuff work. Um, so is there a certain level of so okay, I remember what the question was going to be. Is the farming is the cultivation being done mostly on the actual surface of the moon using soil from Earth, or is it being done like in the space station that's just going to be stationed on the moon?
It's going to be inside of a habitat. Um,
Okay,
yeah,
yeah, that's what I kind of figured, but maybe you mentioned that and I missed it. But no, that definitely makes a lot more sense. So something similar to what we kind of saw on The Martian, some kind of greenhouse on the moon of sorts.
absolutely. I believe in The Martian though he does use Martian soil.
He does.
It's been a long time, and that would not be feasible with the moon.
Right.
Um,
No, exactly.
yeah,
That
moon dust is very igneous. It would not work.
hmm. So what is the appeal, necessarily? I guess just because of the proximity in comparison to Mars, but what's the appeal in growing crops on the moon versus other surrounding bodies of space matter?
Right. So proximity is a big plus for the moon.
Hmm.
With the moon, we can send communications, and there's approximately a 30-second delay. So you send a comm saying the corn grew, and 30 seconds later, Houston gets it, and 30 seconds later, the people on the moon get a hurrah.
Hmm.
So that delay, 30 seconds seems like a long time, but on Mars, it is significantly longer. And there's even a 2-week period on Mars where there's no communication at all. The
Wow.
sun is in the way. So if something were to go wrong, and I mean, I know we're talking about plants, what's going to go wrong with plants, but should something go wrong, there is a big issue there. That could be
Hmm.
2 weeks that nobody knows anything happened or what happened. And so the moon is definitely the best way to go in terms of a test base.
Hmm.
Growing plants on the moon, as opposed to currently we are growing plants in orbit around Earth in microgravity. And so we can study that pretty well. But growing plants on the moon is going to create a whole new set of issues where we're going to have a less controlled atmosphere. We're going to have opening doors, and we're going to have people coming in that are carrying microparticles of moon dust. And
Hmm.
how is that going to affect the plants? And right now, the International Space Station is pretty well protected from solar radiation, but on the moon, they will not be. Solar radiation could mutate the plants. We could see two-headed tomatoes or whatever coming out of these. It could cause them just to wilt. And if the radiation doses reach high enough, the plants could just all die.
Hmm.
It's a little worrisome.
Yeah, no, I can imagine it would be. And that actually led into another question I had, which was it's kind of a two-part question. One of them was what, because obviously we talked about the environment of the moon is not the most ideal for growing crops and growing really any kind of plant life. What preventative measures or what protective gear are they using to watch over and kind of protect these crops? And second of all, let's assume that this gear is ineffectual, or even if it is effective, that the environment of the crops is so different than their home back on Earth. What changes do you think we will be able to see? And I know that's kind of impossible to predict, but like, do you think we'll see crops that are much different than the ones we grew on Earth just because of their environment, or do you think that because it's so stagnant and it's so close to what we have here, they're going to remain largely the same?
Right. So to address the gear and the equipment question, they're definitely going to need to be closed off, and I think that'll help a lot. Right now, in terms of radiation shielding, you don't need a whole lot. But okay, sorry, let me start over. You need a lot over a lot of area to protect the humans, but plants, you need more. So instead of spending the extra money to put that more over the entire area, you can just put that in the enclosed area where the plants would be, and you can protect them from radiation more or less.
Hmm.
In terms of how humans interact with it and when they take it to harvest and have it in storage, it's going to be a lot harder to keep it from mutating. And if they end up splicing or reproducing like potatoes, um, you could see defects definitely appear down the line. I don't know exactly what kind of defects we would see. I know that they have since spotted defects in leaf size, bloom rate, and even like plant color. I think on the ISS they grew like a purple flower that had never been like purple before,
Hmm.
just from like radiation mutating it. It's almost random just in how what little piece of radiation will strike what little piece of the plant's genome. You could get almost anything.
Hmm. Interesting. So changing gears just a little bit, obviously here on Earth, we like you mentioned earlier, we grow food in terms of trying to get as much food as possible in the shortest amount of time possible. Obviously, for the time being, all these agricultural projects and all this plant science, all these kinds of projects are going to be experimental for a while. When do you see, if ever, us reaching a commercial level of production on the moon or on Mars or in other outer world type environments?
A commercial level would be expensive and probably very difficult to obtain
Mm.
out of world, because mostly everything that you'd need to grow it would actually kind of have to be shipped from Earth. So I don't think you'd ever be able to obtain a commercial level of growth.
Mm.
If anything, you'd be able to do self-sustaining, and that's almost a stretch at that. It's definitely, at least as of current, not planned to sustain a full population, but is more to just kind of limit how much little MREs they have to eat
Mm.
and kind of get them a diverse diet.
So, from that point of view, a lot of people have been looking at the idea, and people who aren't quite as familiar with how agriculture works have been looking at the idea of, if we're running out of land on Earth to grow food, why don't we just grow food on on the moon, on Mars, on other planets, and we can ship it back to Earth, that way we can eat it. If the commercial level thing isn't going to be an effective method, for a long time, if ever, what would you say is besides just the experimental portion of it, but what's kind of the advantage to being able to grow crops outside of Earth?
The advantage is the promise of growth.
Mm.
And when I say growth, I don't mean plant growth, but of people growth. It's
Mm-hmm.
the same thing that pushes us to go to the moon in the first place. I mean, why are we there? And it's that option that we have. It's there, so we'll go there and we'll put a plant there. And that plant, it grew, and we can grow that plant anywhere. We can go anywhere and we can have food if we want to. It would take a lot. It would take a lot of work from whoever's sending it and whatever, but we can. It's that almost like winning attitude, that competitive thrill that's in humans to just kind of go and do it because we can.
Yeah, no, I'd say it's a pretty fair reason, especially in the United States, we have a tendency to want to just be the best at everything.
Yeah.
So in that regard, is there somewhat of a space race going on right now between different countries for this kind of stuff, or are different scientific organizations kind of working together on this?
And that's what I love about space, is we have such communication and cooperation between all these different organizations to just reach that competitive winning. We're not competing against anyone but ourselves, and I think it really helps drive it. There's no race other than, yay, we did it, versus we couldn't do it this time, let's try again. And I think sometimes that kind of pushes people a little bit harder.
Yeah, no, I would definitely agree. I mean, the competitive nature of just wanting to be better than not necessarily someone else, but just want to be better than how you were yesterday. I think that's a massive driving force for a lot of people in a lot of different aspects of life. So that definitely makes a lot of sense. I did want to kind of talk about, because you mentioned that the idea behind being able to grow food on other, not necessarily other planets, but also just outer world environments. It gives way to the idea that we could potentially colonize, or that there's a potential for growth as a society through those methods. That just reminded me of the idea that, and this is something that was actually quoted in The Martian, which is ironic enough, but it's the idea that agriculture tends to be the founding piece of a society, that civilization tends to follow where the food can be grown. Does that seem to be kind of the inspiration behind this project in the first place?
Oh yeah. I mean, if you look back at ancient civilizations, all their cities were next to rivers. where food could grow. And if we can put food on the moon, and we can do it in large quantities successfully, repetitively, I definitely feel like you could have people there too. And I think the people will follow. Only the rich people, only the people who can afford to go there, but eventually commercial property on the moon is not unobtainable.
If you had to give an estimate, I know this is kind of difficult, but if you had to give an estimate, how far away do you think we are from that?
From commercial land, I think we're pretty far. Right now, NASA and the Artemis program are going to have astronauts on the moon again in 2024, which is amazing. Their base that I am currently designing is slated to be up there, constructed with people in it in 2028. And I think from there, there's just so much to do, and we can't start with food. They have to test electronics and breathing apparatus and the structure and everything else that is needed to keep alive. And they can just munch on the little powdered pockets that they have and be happy. And once they have all that, they can start looking at food. And I think we're looking at least 50 to 100 years before we're looking at commercial land.
Wow. Yeah, that'll definitely be an interesting sight to see, to say the least. No, there's definitely something to be said about, just from the agricultural perspective of things, just because this is an agriculturally based podcast, there's something to be said about the power of the ability to grow food and how that influences society and civilizations to kind of just build their way around it. I actually just did an episode recently about a guy who researched Johnny Appleseed and where he plants his trees and that sort of thing. And
that's very cool.
Yeah, no, it was actually incredibly interesting. And he said that there was no civilization where he planted his orchards, and civilizations tended to just pop up out of nowhere after he planted them. And so there was this kind of just natural attraction to where there was fertile land and where there was food. And so that's really interesting that these space organizations are almost creating the incentive to civilize, to just go and colonize in a commercial way is kind of the long-term goal, obviously, but just, the idea of getting people on board with that notion of, hey, we can grow food on the moon. Maybe it is okay to leave Earth now. And because I know that I'm sure that there's some level of opposition. I'm not sure if you've heard or faced any, but I can imagine there's some level of opposition to, the idea of growing food on the moon or the idea of colonizing other planets or any of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I personally have never experienced that opposition beyond the few slightly insane people, but they oppose everything. So,
right.
No, I haven't really experienced any opposition in terms of let's leave. I feel like just about everyone is kind of on board with space travel, or at least everyone I hang around. But yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's been my experience as well. I haven't really met anybody who's saying like, let's just stay on Earth, because I think everyone agrees that we're getting a little heavy populated and we're starting to run out of resources. So it's probably not the worst idea to look for other options, even if we're not at that extreme yet. But it definitely seems to be a topic of conversation that most people tend to agree on. I mean, I personally wouldn't want to leave Earth. This is my home, but I definitely understand the desire for adventure and, the people who want to go, be the first person on the moon or the first person to live on Mars or whatever. That I definitely get that. Just not for me. I don't want to ride in a rocket ship.
That's fair.
So awesome. Was there anything else from the project specifically that you wanted to discuss, or anything of interest that you think would be cool to talk about?
I didn't have anything else. If I didn't have anything else prepared, no.
Okay. So in terms of the the ability to grow food on the moon, what do you think is kind of the most impressive aspect of that, in terms of the technology or the how fast we were able to figure it out, or maybe it's the mutation? Like what has been your favorite part about working on this project and learning about all this?
My favorite part has been seeing how they learn from what they see. So as they gather data from the space station currently orbiting, they modify their tech. They realize, oh, this doesn't work so well, or this works. Let's amplify that a little bit, and they are able to put up new tech to like try new things. They've been growing plants up there for a while, and just in 2018, they put up a whole new machine to do it uh, at a more efficient rate. And I think that's definitely what we're going to need to see. We're going to need to see testing, analyzing, and fixing. And if we can continue to do that, we can get places faster.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I think that's kind of that's kind of the scientific method in a nutshell, isn't it? You know, you have an idea, you try it out, you fail, you have another idea, you try it out again, and so you just keep doing it until you figure out what works and what doesn't, right?
100%.
So, actually, I did have a question. I just lost. Oh, I remember what it was now. So we've talked a lot about crops being able to be grown outside of Earth that are used for food purposes. Are there any crops or any plants that are being used right now for these experiments that aren't for food? Maybe they're for ornamental purposes, or they're for other utilities?
They did grow flowers.
Oh,
They grew these flowers on the ISS.
those are
And
the purple ones you mentioned.
yes, I
Okay.
can't exactly remember what kind of flowers they were. But there's a relatively famous astronaut, Scott Kelly. He actually holds the record for being in space the longest.
Wow.
And one time when he was in charge of the flowers, they were dying, and he changed the procedure a little bit and managed to save them. We actually gained a lot of information out of that, and he managed to take a bouquet and post it on his Instagram for Valentine's Day. So it was a win-win for everybody.
That's awesome. So, do you think that where was I going? I don't know what my brain is doing today. I keep having questions and losing them as I'm saying them.
I was doing that earlier. You're good.
Okay. So one thing I did want to kind of cover is some of the technological and scientific practices that we're using on Earth atmosphere or on Earth agriculture. Are some of those things being used in space? So I'll give you an example. So in Earth, obviously we're using genetic modification. We're using different chemicals like pesticides, fertilizers. We're using antibiotics for animals, which obviously that's not going to be used yet. Are there certain aspects of these technologies and these methods that are being used in a lot of the space crops? Like, are we seeing GMO plants used because they're able to adapt faster or anything like that?
To my knowledge, they're not using any of that yet.
Okay.
So one of the issues with growing crops in microgravity is they have a tough time staying upright. Just like we see with people, and they lose muscle mass and their bones actually get weaker. We see the same thing with plants, which is why, as I mentioned earlier, they ate lettuce. Lettuce doesn't really have to hold itself up like a stalk of corn does. So they are having trouble holding themselves up, and they're talking about doing genetically modified organisms that already have less of that, and trying to grow them on Earth to see if we can figure out a better procedure for growing plants that are laying down instead of sticking up.
Huh. Well, that'd be incredibly interesting to see if they were able to develop anything like that that'd be basically able to resist the gravitational effects of of being in that environment. So that it always amazes me the kinds of things they're capable with genetic modification. I mean, they've pulled off so many amazing things so far, and every time I read about a new thing they're doing, it always surprises me, which is super cool. I'm a big science nerd, so every time I read that stuff, I get super excited.
Yeah.
So cool. I'm trying. I think those are all the questions I had. I thought I had another one, but I cannot remember what it was. Did you have any questions, any comments, anything else you wanted to discuss?
Yeah, I had a question for you actually.
Oh.
What do you feel is like the best way to handle proper crop rotation in such a small area? Like, is it as important? Like, because I know I've had family, that rotates crops out of these 100-acre fields. But if we're running little trays of 2-inch by like a few feet, is it as important? Do we have to monitor crop rotation as much, or can we just kind of try and inject our own nutrients?
I think it's a great question. So the primary purpose of crop rotation is to prevent leaching. And as I'm sure you know, leaching is when you have a crop in soil and it's been there for too long, and so it sucks out a lot of the necessary nutrients in it. And so once you put the next crop in, it may not have as abundant amounts of nutrients for that crop. And so you try to crop rotate on a regular basis to try to mix up what nutrients are being used. That way the soil has the opportunity to regenerate some of the nutrients that it lost. In terms of the small scale, like you mentioned, you have like a little like 2-inch by 2-inch or 2 foot by 2 foot, whatever the measurements were for those operations. I don't really know, because if you're using artificial nutrients anyways, I'm not really sure if it's necessary to do crop rotation. I think it would just kind of depend on what crops you're using and what the long-term goal of that crop is. Because obviously, like we mentioned, like we've said on multiple occasions here, we're using crops for commercial production, and so we're getting them in and out extremely quickly. If in an experimental situation, that might not be as fast, and so there might be more utility in leaving the crop in there longer, and that might cause leaching. But if you have the resources to just artificially regenerate that nutrient count, then that might be the smarter play anyway, just to make sure that the crop gets to its maximum maturity in the most healthy way possible.
Right.
So I think it depends. I think it's kind of there's a few different factors that need to be determined first.
Okay, thank you.
Hope that kind of answered.
Yeah, no, that made a lot of sense. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, crop rotation is kind of it's a weird topic because it's so not controversial, but in modern soil science, there's a lot of controversy around whether or not we should be using it the way that in the ways that we are. Because like tillage is kind of controversial now too, because there's no-till practices that are being used that have positive effects and have negative effects and all this kind of stuff. So crop rotation has always kind of been agreed to be a positive practice, but the ways that crop rotation are used and what levels and what capacity and all that kind of stuff have been debated for some time now. So it's kind of difficult to determine how it would work on a scientific scale, just because we're using it for production purposes. So obviously it's a different kind of scenario.
Right.
So yeah, but no, that's a good question. I actually hadn't thought about even the idea of using crop rotation in a scientific sphere.
Yeah, and I think one of the big issues is trying to maintain the same nutrient levels per batch, so we can really get a consistent, repeatable measure.
Yeah, and that actually brings up another question. So, are you guys using methods that are similar to what we use in agriculture down here? I mean, obviously, like you're not like we just talked about crop rotation. Are you guys using other? I'm assuming you're not tilling, because you don't have fields to till. But
Right.
Are there other methods of agriculture that you've kind of taken? Like you go to a farm here and you say, hey, they're doing that thing. Let's try that on in the lab and see if it works.
Yeah, that is definitely happening to some degree, at least on a small scale.
Right.
Yeah, that's of course, like you said, not tilling, but we are looking at moving dirt and trying to like just kind of keep everything a little more consistent with what we see on Earth, so we can see how they compare a little better.
Yeah, that's really interesting. If you're able to, would you mind kind of discussing what the what the staff looks like for that kind of research? Like, do you guys have to have like an abundance of botanists and soil scientists, I'd assume, but like what kind of professionals do you need to have involved for that kind of thing?
To be honest, I don't quite know. That's not exactly my department.
That makes sense. I wasn't sure if you had to work with any of those guys because of the way you have to construct the hub or not.
No, not really.
Okay. Yeah, so because in soil science, we learned very recently that I should say very recently, but it's a more recent discovery that soil is more or less a living being in and of itself, and so the way we care for soil is a massive determining factor of how healthy crops can become, and so I think that's kind of interesting that you brought up the idea of crop rotation and that you're importing soil and importing artificial nutrients. I'd be curious to see what level of soil health is being maintained in the contained unit that they're being farmed in, because obviously on Earth we have constantly regenerating soil that can constantly be fixing itself and readjusting, and we can fix it using different types of crops and all that kind of stuff. That's not exactly a luxury you have up there. There's a lot more limitation on what resources you're able to use to regenerate that soil, and if your microbiomes die, your crop dies. So I'd be curious to see what countermeasures are being kind of put in place for that.
Right. So that is a big issue, is because you do have these microbiomes, and you do have like bugs and other stuff down here that definitely helps plant growth. You also have some that hurts, but a lot that helps. Mm-hmm. And that's not really something that we can put up in space all too well. Mm-hmm. And so it is a lot harder to kind of maintain that plant health, and we have to keep a careful eye and lots of probes. And it's definitely a process. It's fun though.
Yeah, no, I can definitely see how that could be very interesting, but very, very fun. I can imagine the amount of regulation on that kind of stuff is just extremely stringent. You have to have like the perfect temperature, you have to have the perfect moisture content, you have to have the perfect all that kind of stuff. Just because, like you said, you can't rely on the environment to take care of those crops as much as it would down on Earth. Like, you don't have beneficial insects, you don't have the consistency of the climate, but you can artificially create a lot of those types of effects on the crop health as well. So I'm sure you guys have technology way more advanced than a simple greenhouse that we use down here for that kind of stuff.
A little bit. So some of it is pretty similar though, in terms of timers and sprayers, all that kind of fun stuff.
Yeah, no, I've learned very quickly that agriculture, well, I've kind of known this for a while, but after talking to people who work in more technologically advanced industries, I've learned very quickly that agriculture is one of the most technologically advanced industries in the world. I mean, some of the technology we use is stuff that's not even used in other industries that we tend to consider technologically advanced, like the automobile industry.
Right. There's a lot of science in agriculture.
There is. I
mean, a lot that kind of goes overlooked by many.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there's a whole branch of agricultural jobs that are considered agri-science. Like, it has nothing to do with farming. It's all about determining, like we talk about soil science. There's certain aspects of research that needs to be put into producing these crops in a way that are not only healthy and abundant, but also effective and quick. And that doesn't just happen overnight. And farmers don't have time to figure that stuff out on their own. So there's tons of science jobs related to agriculture that people tend to just forget exists.
Yeah, it's a whole different light.
Yeah, no, definitely. But no, it's really interesting stuff. I always enjoy learning more about other industries as well as my own. So, yeah, I mean, did you have any other questions? Anything else you wanted to discuss? I think I kind of covered everything I was thinking of.
Yeah, you covered everything I had. So
awesome. Well, yeah, if you end up having any more questions, or maybe you have other things in agriculture you want to discuss, you're welcome to come back on for another episode. I mean, it doesn't have to be about space. We could just talk general ag or whatever.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for coming on. And before we close out here, I'd like to give you an opportunity to kind of replug your podcast if you want to do that, or plug anything else that you want to have linked down in the description or anything like that.
Yeah. Okay. I do run my own podcast called Know Too Much. I bring in guests who just kind of know too much about one specific topic, and we talk about what they know. Right now I have someone who just looked at gender discrimination in video games from when they were made. I have someone who knows all about the life of the rapper Eminem. It's all these people who just looked into something and they just got really hooked on it. And it's actually really fun. It's looking into lives of others. It's things you wouldn't think about.
Yeah, no, that sounds very, very interesting. I mean, I'm looking forward to tuning in and listening to it myself. But I definitely recommend to all of you listeners out there to go check Jake out. He's a brand new podcaster, and you guys know how much we like to support our fellow podcasters and help out the new guys, because it's tough out there. It took me 2.5 years to figure out how to not suck at this. But no, it's all in good fun. But I definitely appreciate you reaching out and wanting to be on the episode. I hope that everything goes well with your podcast. If there's anything I can do to help out, let me know. I'm always here for the new guys.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. And so I think if that's it, if you don't have any other questions or comments or anything else you want to make, that's pretty much all we got, right?
That's all I got.
Awesome. I hope all of you enjoyed the episode. It was definitely a lot of fun, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. Thank you again to our guest and to all of you who are tuning in. And thanks for all the support that you guys give on every episode. Thanks again to Faith for donating to this podcast. A monthly subscription, which again is not necessary or obligatory, but I greatly appreciate it all the same. Thanks again to our sponsor, Anchor, and all that you do in terms of financial investment of this podcast. And that's all I have for you guys. So I hope to hear from you next week. And don't forget, if you ate today, thank a farmer.